All right, let's get started. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Cassie Rouser. I'm the Executive Director of UCLA Sustainable LA Grand Challenge. The Sustainable LA Grand Challenge is an interdisciplinary, university-wide initiative aimed at applying UCLA research, expertise, and education to help transform Los Angeles into the world's most sustainable megacity by 2050. Making it the most livable, equitable, resilient, clean, and healthy megacity and an example for the world. Today, you'll hear about recent findings from UCLA and Cal State Northridge researchers that will contribute to moving Los Angeles toward a more resilient and sustainable city. These research projects were co-developed between the academic researchers and practitioners at the LA Department of Water and Power to address challenges along the utilities path in meeting the city's ambitious climate goals. This work occurred through a unique partnership between UCLA Sustainable LA Grand Challenge and LADWP to bring together great minds from across the city to innovate together and accelerate our city's response to the climate crisis. Today, you will learn more about UCLA's Energy Atlas, how the region's transition to clean energy will impact air quality and our health, local green jobs, and an assistance and training program to help reduce emissions. I'm going to pass it over to Steve Bowell, our partner and Director of Sustainable Projects at LADWP. Steve?
Thanks, Cassie. So when we started this project about 4 years ago, it was really to, help LADWP and the city of LA to really, ask the academic community, how can they support us in our sustainability goals. I think what's also unique is, this gives the opportunity for researchers in the area to really do applied research. So we're really excited to, share what we have been doing these past couple of years. Now, this is the second installment. Our first installment, we did water. So this time we're focusing on power. And you probably see a theme throughout these projects is that there's a lot of focus on equity. And most of these projects are looking at how the community can help us transition to 100% clean energy in the near future. So thanks again for joining us, and I look forward to hearing questions and the presentations that we have today. Right, thanks, Kathy.
Thanks, Steve. So we're just going to jump right into these. First off today, we have Stephanie Pincetl. She's a professor at the UCLA Institute of the Environment and Sustainability and founding director of the California Center for Sustainable Communities at UCLA. Dr. Pincetl conducts research on environmental policies and governance and analyzes how institutional rules influence how natural resources and energy are used to support human activities and create Earth systems impacts. Her focus is on social and environmental justice and the need to develop equitable strategies to reduce human impacts on the planet. Today, Dr. Pincetl will talk about the UCLA Energy Atlas and how it can be used to prepare for a green energy future. The LADWP project managers for the most recent Energy Atlas work stemming from the LA 100 Equity Strategies project include Simon Zudu, Dennis Obiang, and Pijoy Chua from LADWP's Power System. Stephanie?
Thank you. Thank you, Cassie. Really appreciate that introduction to present work that is actually a collaborative effort from among us at my center, the California Center for Sustainable Communities, and LADWP. So thank you. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how the Energy Atlas can help address building energy use, household energy burdens, and electrification barriers, which are all very important for LADWP to address in the goal of becoming 100% renewable shortly, actually, quite shortly. So my center has had about 10 years of working closely with LADWP and other Southern California utilities to develop this Energy Atlas. So I want to acknowledge that partnership. It's very, very important. And it's a long-term research project that combines account level energy usage data with building attributes. This is really, really important so that we understand energy use and the size of the building, the age of the building, sociodemographic features, and that helps illustrate and understand distributional inequities in the energy system. And so as you'll see, the Energy Atlas is a public-facing tool that has a website, interactive website with maps and tools that are designed to support local governments and entities like LADWP and community-based organizations. We also perform quantitative analyses for state agencies and other organizations involved with energy system planning and governance. This gives you a sense of what is in the Energy Atlas. We have the consumption data from the utilities. We combine that with county parcel data, assessor data, the census, administrative boundaries, others, explorer potential, on. In the back end, we have all this PII data that is securely protected in order to ensure nobody's gets leaked out, which would be a terrible thing. And then we put this together in a relational database that organizes account level energy consumption and these spatial relationships so that we can begin to understand patterns of energy use across the territories. So the front end website, you can look it up, UCLA Energy Atlas, and you can begin to see how these query these different attributes interactively and begin to tell you stories about the place, like the residential income, the vintage, and so on. So you can see here what the Energy Atlas can do. You have a bar across the total energy consumption of buildings, single family by neighborhood, and then scroll down each one of those tabs and achieve different kinds of understandings depending what you're looking at, your natural gas, single family, multiple family, commercial, and so on. You can see that looks here, you're scrolling through, and it is a very revealing opportunity to see what the relationships are like in different places in Atlas. Other related tools, we've also been looking at solar opportunities that could serve communities. NREL has also developed a similar tool. They look exactly alike, actually. Interactive mapping tool that was, we did it with and so this is all going forward. In the scope of this project, we're going to use our security environment sensitive structured data from to and we aggregate and disseminate these data so that the right information to the right UCM research staff to support equity-focused analysis. And you'll see the following graphics provide a high level of our project tasks. And essentially what we are doing is serving as a kind of data backbone to a number of the projects that are going on at UCLA for LADW. My internet does not seem to be cooperating quite well, so let me share my screen again. I'm sorry. Okay, so let me see. So we have a platform, as I explained, for maintaining and sharing privacy protected project data. We are doing an analysis of gas appliances and the kinds of electrification needs that are going to be necessary if we're going to be moving to 100% electric services. We are also looking at electric service panel upgrade analysis. That's very important because many of the panels are not sufficiently they don't have the capacity to move to full electrification. We're looking at the energy burden today, and then looking at small commercial electric use data, because small commercial is a hugely important part of our economy, but we don't pay very much attention to that, particularly in underserved communities. What the electrification burden is going to look like for those small scale commercial enterprises is really important. Let's see, I'm not able to move my slides either. Okay, so here's an overview of the project tasks. And I explained that we have this platform that we've developed for sharing privacy protected project data. Then we are adding this question of electrification of gas appliances, how much is going to be required in terms of additional electricity generation. And then we're doing cross-validation of national renewable energy building models. Then we're looking at, as I said, the electric service panel upgrades. We're looking at energy burden, and this is really important because if people are not able to afford their electricity bills today, what is it going to look like as we move towards full electrification and 100% renewable? Are there communities that are going to be even further impacted than they are today? We're also sharing the energy burden policy analysis with the UCLA Luskin Center for Innovation, which will then begin to look at what the new rates should or could look like as we move forward with full electrification of the system, renewable electrification of the system. I'm sorry, I got sort of destabilized by my internet going out. So pardon me, let me gather my thoughts again. If we're moving to 100% renewable energy system, there are going to be very significant costs associated with that, and how we're going to be able to pay for that when we already have people who are heavily energy burdened and can't afford to pay for electricity today is a major question that a lot of this research is going to help inform in order to ensure that we are not increasing an unequal effect on the ratepayers due to our desire to clean up the energy grid. So we are also providing information to our colleagues about the barriers to commercial electrification. That happens to be something that, as I mentioned, is going to be really important to look at. Many, so for example, in the restaurant trades, which serve many people and employ lots of people, most of the cooking is done with gas. If we move to electrification, in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution, what is that going to look like? What if rates go up as well? If we're cleaning up the grid? These kinds of questions have not been sufficiently examined. And so understanding the patterns of electricity use today and natural gas use will help figure out strategies that LADWP can implement in order to relieve the burden on the most disadvantaged and small businesses. That really is all we are working on. There's a lot there. I just wanted to give you a very high level oversight of the work that we're doing. And again, my apologies if I was a little discombobulated due to my internet problems, but I'm happy to answer any questions. Sorry.
No, absolutely, it happens. Hi all, my name is Erin Coots. I am the Executive Director of the LA Regional Collaborative for Climate Action and Sustainability. One of your co-hosts for this event today, and I will be helping to moderate the questions. So please, if questions arose as Dr. Pincetl was talking, please enter them into the chat and I'll read them off from there. I'll kick things off, Dr. Pincetl, with one question. Do you have thoughts on technology options that the region could deploy to help us manage our energy consumption?
To help us manage our energy consumption, or to make the transition to 100% renewable, because those are not necessarily the same.
Let's take, because it ties in later with the an upcoming presentation, to make the transition.
Could you repeat the question, please?
Related to our transition, yes, technology options related to the transition. What would you recommend?
Well, I think that there are quite a lot of different technological decisions that need to be made. So one of the big ones is how much distributed energy resources are we going to deploy in basin, including community solar for renters versus more centralized electricity generation by renewables out of basin. There are lots of questions there that affect transmission infrastructure and distribution infrastructure. And those are real trade-offs in terms of cost, but also questions of the how the utility is able to afford one or the other, because the more distributed generation that you have, people are having rooftop solar, and thus revenue for the utility goes down. At the same time, these are already disturbed lands, and building new centralized facilities on undisturbed lands has huge ecological impacts and other kinds of impacts. So these are very complex kinds of trade-offs, but that is one of the big ones, I think, that is facing us going forward. I also think that the location of community solar, and if we have in-basin battery storage, is another area for discussion, as well as the move towards green hydrogen, and how what green hydrogen actually is, how it's generated, and where we're doing so is another big question for the region.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Can you talk a little bit more about additional policy implications of your research findings and the data collection that you went through?
Sure. I think one of the areas that we don't do enough work in, and that we have really begun to try to pioneer, is the question of energy use excess. We are very, very concerned, and I am completely on board with those who have energy insufficiency and can't pay their bills. But the flip side of that is also energy use excess. And the fact that we have no way to question the size of homes and the amount of energy that is required to power those homes and the effects on the infrastructure, I think is a big question. And because LADWP is under the constraints of Proposition 26, it makes it very difficult for the utility to address the impacts that very high energy use building has on everybody else, creating more difficulty in providing sufficient renewable energy for everybody. So I think that, to me, is something that is really of great concern, because if we're trying to move towards a more equitable energy system, we also have to be able to frankly talk about people who use an enormous amount of energy because of the size of their homes, despite those homes complying with all of the energy efficiency standards that the state has put forward.
Do you have any specific suggestions of how to, like, are there tools that the utility could use to help make things more equitable in terms of pricing, perhaps?
Well, I think that the part of the issue is, as I said, Proposition 26, that constrains utilities relative to being able to increase their rates. And to me, one of the most obvious things to do would be to charge homes that use above a certain threshold of energy quite a lot of money per kilowatt hour, and or in new construction, that those homes have to pay some kind of surcharge on interconnection fees to the grid. Because clearly, if you have panels that are 400 watt, 400 watt panels, those are enormous, and those big homes require that kind of panel. So maybe there's a kind of relationship there that could be established above a 200 watt panel you have to pay for the additional impact on the infrastructure or something of that nature. It will be, but the barrier, as I said, is Proposition 26 and how the utility is able to, how we are able in our public utility to have an equitable rate structure that reflects the kind of additional burden of these kinds of excess energy users is very challenging.
Thank you. We'll take one last question from the chat and then move on. How would you define green hydrogen? It's an ongoing issue among advocates at industry and government.
Well, my understanding, and I'm not an expert in hydrogen by any means, that green hydrogen is generated by using renewable energy resources and not fossil energy. I mean, hydrogen is produced with fossil energy, but green hydrogen, from what I understand, is produced by renewable energy resources. However, they're very highly it's a very energy intensive process. So you need a lot of renewable energy to produce the green hydrogen. On the other hand, the truth of the matter is that a lot of industrial end users need gaseous and high energy density inputs. And so we're caught in a situation where if we want to continue certain kinds of manufacturing, particularly, or transportation infrastructure without gaseous fuels, we're in a real pickle. On the other hand, green hydrogen is really not a technology that I would argue is yet ripe for implementation, and is very highly, it needs a lot of power to create. So we're in a state of transition in that regard.
Thanks so much. I'll pass it back to Cassie.
Do we have time for one more question, Erin? There was one more question that just came into the chat that I think would be great for Stephanie to address. I'll go ahead. So there's a question there that is, how do you plan, but I would say, how would you suggest that the barriers are addressed for people who live in marginalized communities?
That's a really big question. There are lots of different kinds of barriers. I feel that one of the areas that we are not yet sufficiently focused on is really helping communities that have poor building infrastructure to upgrade that infrastructure. And there's a renter-owner split, which is a really big issue. But actually, a lot of buildings are very leaky and don't have very good insulation, which affects them in many ways. They have to use more energy to heat. And they are subject to more high heat in the summertime because they can't protect themselves from high heat. So electrification is one thing, to 100% renewable. Affordable rates is another thing. But actually, the building envelope remains a very, very big barrier to equity going forward. And I'm hoping that the infrastructure, that the Inflation Reduction Act and other federal money will help the region direct some of that money toward improving the building stock that people live in order to ease the off of high energy needs to keep cool in the summertime and or to keep warm in the wintertime.
Great, thank you, Stephanie. We're going to move on to our next presentation today, and that is going to be done by Dr. Yifang. She's a professor in the Department of Environmental Health Sciences at UCLA. Her research addresses air pollution, environmental exposure, assessment, and aerosol science and technology. Dr. Zhu is interested in understanding quantitative exposure and risk assessments on ultrafine particles from various indoor and outdoor sources. Her current research focuses on measuring and modeling ultrafine particle emissions, transport and transformation on and near roadways, as well as in various indoor environments. Today, Dr. Zhu will talk about the air quality and human health benefits of climate mitigation in Los Angeles. The LADWP project managers for this work include Andrea Villarin, and Catherine Rubin from LADWP's Environmental Affairs as part of the LA 100 Equity Strategies Project. Yifang?
Thank you, Kathy. Let me share my screen. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us today. As Kathy mentioned, my research mainly focuses on air pollution and climate change. Both are major public health problems. In public health, we know preventing is preferred to curing. Just take the COVID-19 as example. It's cheaper and safer to vaccine people than to treat large numbers of severe cases. So similarly, in air pollution and climate change, it's better to reduce emissions than to deal with the associated consequences. This motivates us to study the co-benefits of climate mitigation on air quality and human health. Today, I'll share some research findings from our completed California statewide study, and then introduce our ongoing research in the city of Los Angeles. At first glance, air pollution and climate change may seem unrelated, but they both harm environment and human health. For example, greenhouse gases, the leading cause of climate change, are mainly from the extraction and burning of fossil fuels, which also contribute to air pollution. Many air pollutants, such as black carbon and ground level ozone, also affect climate by changing the amount of incoming sunlight and is reflected, absorbed by the atmosphere. So in my mind, climate change and air pollution are actually two sides of the same coin. While air pollution and climate change have many overlaps due to their inherent differences, the research and policy to date on these two topics are often disconnected. To bring these two topics together, we aim to demonstrate that good climate policies can bring substantial environmental and public health benefits to our society. We expect that transitioning Los Angeles and California into 100% renewable energy will reduce emissions, improve air quality, and bring substantial health benefits to the state and the city. To achieve our overarching research goal, we first developed different deep decarbonization pathways that could allow California to meet its greenhouse gas reduction target and estimate what the reductions in air pollutant emissions will be for different pathways. Then we predict how these air pollutant emission reductions would change ambient air quality by focusing on two air pollutants of primary health concerns, fine particulate matter PM2.5 and ozone. Finally, we evaluate how many lives would be saved given those changes in air quality. Our comprehensive modeling framework is shown in this slide. For scenario development, we projected population and economic growth and incorporate technology, policy, and energy efficiency parameters into the model. To meet California's and Los Angeles' ambitious climate goal, we need to cut greenhouse gas emissions across all major sectors, including electricity power generation, transportation, industry, commercial, residential, and agriculture, etc. There are different pathways we can follow to meet exact same greenhouse gas reduction target, but some pathways focus more on alternative fuels, such as bioethanol and biodiesel, which are relatively cheap and easy to implement, but still generate all sorts of air pollutants. Versus other pathways that focus more on electrification and renewable energy, such as wind and solar, which are initially more expensive and difficult to implement, but will improve air quality and save many lives in the long term. Again, in our study, we focused on two major air pollutants, PM2.5 and ozone. PM2.5 is a mixture of small particles which can be directly emitted from various sources, such as vehicles, factories, cooking, and wildfires. PM2.5 can also be generated through chemical reactions of gases in the atmosphere. Ozone, on the other hand, is only produced by photochemical reactions under the sunlight. Because PM 2.5 and ozone are from various sources and undergo complicated physical transport and chemical reactions in the atmosphere, we used a 3D Wolfram model that combines meteorology and chemistry to simulate their concentrations. We'll apply this state-of-the-art model to California and its surrounding areas and simulated what PM 2.5 and ozone concentration would be under each different decarbonization pathway in 2050. And we know from the literature that both PM 2.5 and ozone contribute to premature death, but we need to quantify their health impacts in our study. To do that, we used EPA BEMAP model, which allows us to quantify the relationship between pollutant concentration and mortality rate. So this model allows us to calculate changes in the number of mortalities based on changes in PM 2.5 and ozone concentrations. This slide shows greenhouse gas emission reductions across different sectors relative to business as usual to meet California's climate goal in 2050. As shown in the figure on the left side, transportation sector is still the largest greenhouse gas emission sources in California. Therefore, a higher adoption rate of electric vehicles or zero-emission vehicles is needed to achieve the climate goal, which could also reduce tailpipe emissions dramatically. The figure on the right shows the trend of greenhouse gas reductions over years. By incorporating something called carbon capture and sequestration technology, the CCS can actually offset greenhouse emissions and allow the state to reach net zero target by 2050. As we expected, achieving net zero greenhouse gas emission can bring substantial air quality and public health benefits to the state. Specifically, as shown here on the left, the PM 2.5 concentrations will be reduced substantially by 5 microgram per cubic meter, relative to the baseline is usually on the orders of 10 to 12 microgram per cubic meter in California. But ozone on the right will be increased slightly. Overall, we found implementing net zero climate policy can reduce mortality by avoiding approximately 14,000 deaths annually in the state. Another important finding in our California study is that those health co-benefits are disproportionately higher in disadvantaged communities, as defined by the well-established CalEnviro screen tool. While all communities would benefit, the state's top 25% most polluted census tract, the so-called disadvantaged communities, would receive approximately 35% of the health benefits resulting from the projected improvements in air quality. So this means when we cut down greenhouse gas emissions, we bring disproportionately higher levels of air quality benefits to disadvantaged communities. What we learned from our California-wide study has led us to dive deeper in our current research in Los Angeles, which is part of the bigger effort in LA 100 Equity Strategy Study. Specifically, while we have demonstrated that net zero is achievable in California by 2050, LA is even more ambitious. It is aiming to transition to 100% renewable energy by 2035. What we learned from California is electrified transportation sector is important for the state, which leads us to focus on vehicle electrification in LA 100 Equity Strategy Study. This is especially important for LA, since vehicle emissions are the main reason why LA has the worst air quality in the nation. Residents in LA County are exposed to 60% more vehicle pollution than the state average. Finally, what we found in California inspires us to focus more on the disadvantaged communities in Los Angeles. In our LA 100 equity strategy studies, we don't want just to model air quality and health benefits from electrification of the mobile sources. We want to understand to what extent an equitable electrification of the transportation system could bring additional air quality and health benefits to disadvantaged communities. To achieve that, we envision 3 scenarios. The first scenario, we call it zero emission vehicle ZIF disparity scenario, distributes emission reduction from light duty zero emission vehicles across different LA communities in 2035 based on the current ZIF adoption rates and trends. The second scenario, we call it ZIF equity scenario, distributes light duty zero emission vehicle emission reductions more equally across different LA communities in 2035. And what we learned from talking to community organizations and leaders, many disadvantaged communities are located near major transportation corridors with heavy truck traffic. So the third scenario aims to compare the environmental and health benefits for making medium and heavy duty vehicles zero emissions. From those scenario development, we'll then apply the same modeling framework as we did for the state to estimate emission changes, air quality improvement, and associated health benefits for LA. So if you're interested in more details about our research, please find those more information in our published papers as listed here on this slide. I also want to acknowledge the UCLA Sustainable LA Grant Challenge and LADWP for funding those studies. Finally, I want to encourage policymakers and stakeholders to use our study as a tool to develop stronger regulations that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, improve air quality, and protect public health, particularly for communities disproportionately burdened by air pollution. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Folks who are on the line, please encourage you to join us in asking questions via the chat. We will take those questions from there. I'll kick things off with a question about your strategies and recommendations. How do those play into the efforts that are currently ongoing in Los Angeles to make improving air quality a priority?
Thank you, Erin. That's a great question. As we know, LA is perhaps the world leader, California is the world leader in terms of combating air pollution problems. The air quality in LA in particular has improved dramatically over the past 40 years, despite dramatic increase of economic growth, population growth, and even in the face of increased vehicle miles traveled. There are many, many lessons have learned, and successful programs, policy have been implemented to improve the air quality in LA over decades. What I'm trying to, I guess, argue and trying to make people to think more here is the synergy, the potential synergy of incorporating climate policies into air quality improvement to further improve the air quality. Most of the air quality regulations and policies are very much focusing on like individual industry sectors or tailpipe emission reductions. What we're envisioning here is in the broader context of climate mitigations, can we envision the transformative changes of our energy structures, right? Electrifying the buildings and mobile sources. So we see like a paradigm shift moving from fossil fuel burnings, rather than trying to deal with emission permits at individual unit level and individual like type of vehicles, but thinking about paradigm shifting in the context of mitigation climate. I think there's lots of synergy that air quality regulation policies can be like going hands in hands with climate mitigation policies to achieve that.
Thank you. I see a question from the chat. Are you concerned about questions regarding the efficacy of carbon capture and storage? the understanding is that it's not a clearly proven technology to reduce GHGs.
Yeah, the carbon sequestration technology is relatively new technology. You know, I'm not an engineer per se. What we have learned from reading the literatures and, you know, working in our developing this roadmap to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions into net zero, meaning there has to be some sort of like negative ways that we can, you know, sequester and capture carbons from emission sources to achieve that. You know, I acknowledge it is a new technology, and there's still sort of like debates and discovery phases on how to make the technologies more efficient, more mature, but it has potential to offset some of the greenhouse gas emissions, which we really need to achieve net zero target.
I wanted to ask you about the mortality from air pollution because it results from non-local emissions. What can be done to reduce the impact of pollution from outside of Los Angeles?
That's a very great question. So in our model, we don't have time to get to the details, but you know, one of the papers that I shared in my last slide is we actually looked into both local emissions versus regional transport emissions, and how does that play out in terms of contributing to the ambient air quality levels in a particular like LA as example. So what we found is there are definitely long range transport, and there are actually contributing to good amount of mortality as well. So air pollution relative to climate change, everything everybody agree is a global issue, but I also want to say it's also a local issue. Air quality on the other side, people tend to think it's a local issue, but it's also a global issue. So lots of the efforts that I think I want to advocate and I want people to think more about is collaborations, not just within your own city, but with you know, the airshed, with the state, other state, and even across countries, across borders, because air pollution won't stop just because you have a city line or a country line or even the Pacific in between. It's gonna transport. So it really takes a lot of collaboration work to co-address greenhouse gas emission reductions, which is absolutely gonna benefit everybody, and as well as air quality as well. So that's a very important question. You know, in fact, the ozone issues in Southern California is really hard to tackle without some collaboration efforts with like regions outside of LA, outside of California.
Do you see opportunities for LADWP to collaborate, like through what mechanisms, or through which governance mechanisms? And
yeah, I definitely think there are like potential collaboration opportunities, and you know, I'm more on the air pollution field. So you know, I know agencies like regional agencies like South Coast Air Quality Management District, and state agencies, California Air Resource Board. There, you know, and even in the climate, there's also climate sort of like a policy institute that are also trying to do more international work, and not just doing work within their jurisdictions, but try to develop collaborations, like things like you know, ocean-going vessels, international aircrafts, lots of emissions, both for air pollutant and for greenhouse gases. Those emission sources is really beyond the jurisdiction of local agencies, and there are lots of activities going on trying to develop some international collaborations to address those sources, which are, you know, as LA become cleaner for our local sources, those sources will become even more important moving forward. When you know, when we transition into 100% renewable, reduce a lot of local sources, then those regional transport emissions will become even more important.
thank you. I see a question in the chat. Are there any climate strategies that might come into conflict with air quality goals? For instance, protecting households who are susceptible to extreme heat might need additional air conditioning, which comes with heat rejection and increased electric demand.
Yeah, this is an excellent question. Thank you for it. So everything has a like trade-off. Like today, my talk focusing on co-benefits. There's also some research activities and trying to fully understand. There's also perhaps certain aspects that could offset the benefits. But I think what I envision is really depends on where we get our energy. If we're getting our energy from clean sources, then having a little bit more additional demands on the power wouldn't be really a bad thing. Again, I think that's why, I think just focusing on the tailpipe emission reductions controls or like endpoint emission reduction controls is not going to address the whole situation. In public health, there's downstream and upstream mitigations. We want to think about upstream, like changing where we get our power, right? And then where we got our energy, how we envision that transition will look like. That will mitigate a lot of those like unexpected consequences, as Crist put into the chat.
Thank you so much. One last question. What informed, it's a wonky one, so this is for the researchers who are here on the line. What informed your comprehensive modeling framework, and how can this be applied to other research?
Yeah, thank you for that. So so the thinking that motivates us to develop this comprehensive modeling framework is actually adapted from something that we use a lot in environmental health science field. We always envision so like where people get exposed, but starting from where emissions come from, and how those emissions, pollutants, get transported and transformed in the atmosphere, and eventually reach people get exposed and develop health effects. So there's a huge paradigm in environmental health science field that covers like from the emission all the way to the health outcomes. So our model was inspired from that. We just developed it more specific to address climate and air quality co-benefits. But the framing work or the thinking about this process can be applied to water problems, wildfire problems, and many other, like even infection disease problems. So I don't think it's just limited to our particular study, and the whole framing work thinking about where pollutant get emitted and what's the route they go through to reach people and cause health effect. That's basically what we think through to develop our specific model to address our specific questions. But this overarching thinking, I really think it can be applied to many other environmental issues and climate issues too.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Zhu.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Yifang. We're going to move on to the next presentation today, and that will be done by Dr. Raúl Hinojosa-Oieda. He is the founding director of the North American Integration and Development Center and associate professor in UCLA's Department of Chicano, and Central American Studies. Dr. Hinojosa is the author of numerous articles and books on the political economy of regional integrations in various parts of the world, and include evaluations on the trade, investment, and migration relations between the US, Mexico, Latin America, and the Pacific Rim. Today, Dr. Hinojosa-Oieda will talk about green jobs related to LA's energy transition. The LADWP project managers for this work include Simon Zudu, Dennis Obiang, and Pijoy Chua from LADWP's power system as part of the LA 100 Equity Strategies project. Raúl?
Thank you, Cassie, and it's great to be here with everybody. Yeah, let me share a screen here. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about is LA green jobs, and what does it mean for the energy transition that's being contemplated in Los Angeles. We're both looking at a quantification methodology here, as well as what is now being used, broadly speaking, as an ESG, environmental, social, and governance analysis, which is going to be extremely important to compare what's going to go on in LA to multiple places around the world, which are beginning to use ESG frameworks. And I'll talk a little bit about how we anticipate on developing this research going forward. So, today, basically, what is the ESG and what we're going to talk about today? the environmental impacts of the E is mostly measured within the carbon footprint. And here we'll have a transition baseline to different strategies for reaching 100% renewable energy by 2035. This research will be enhanced in what's called the direct, indirect, and induced carbon footprint. How do we look not only at direct emissions, but how does that filter throughout the regional economy through supply chains, both within the basin and of course outside of the basin. I won't talk too much about that today. I will talk about S, the social equity footprint, just like there's a carbon footprint. And how do we think about this in a just transition? How do we think about a transition towards a new employment, not only by the energy sector, which is what a big focus of what we're doing with DWP is, but also in general, the green jobs transition. And again, this concept of direct, indirect, and induced. How do we not only are seeing the immediate effects, but throughout the supply chain, and the supply chain, both within the basin and the out of basin. And one thing which I'll touch on at the end in one of our case studies is the notion of our out of basin social equity footprint, which extends through our labor market supplies that we link us to climate change in other parts of the world, particularly Latin America. Now, the other issue that's very important is the governance for just transition. We are developing in parallel to this quantitative research, a case study in how communities develop visions and strategies for their own workforce and community resilient employment, and how specifically does DWP and other institutions develop a governance commitment to this. So very quickly, we know, we've seen from our colleagues before that there is this commitment of 100% renewable energy by 2035, which will imply a important change in mix of activities. Our primary goal here is to look at the green jobs and the DWP job projections and what would happen over this period of time. And like I said, then work on this community engagement case study as how does that translate to strategies that can affect the necessary type of workforce development and community development going forward that needs to be reached in order to reduce the inequity footprint actually of our energy sectors and what our new environmental tech infrastructure needs to look like as the demographic transformations of LA continue over the next 10 to 15 years. So number one, Green Jobs Calculator, where we started, is just analyzing the history of green jobs. Green jobs here, by the way, defined as the Department of Commerce defines it, of approximately 350 sectors which are engaged either already in renewable energy or green technologies or are in the process of transitioning. And how do we look at this, again, this direct, indirect, and induced broad effect of how jobs are changing? And we specifically then focus on the regional racial equity and the interdependence between different racial groups in this transition. So we are, I'll move quickly here just to summarize, we are growing green jobs. It's a very important point, it's particularly in the city. Our green jobs as defined by the Department of Commerce are actually growing rapidly. Now, what's interesting is that who is these green jobs? It's primarily Hispanic workers, and as well as then followed by white workers, African-American workers, Asian. But what's interesting is the indirect effect. In other words, even though Hispanic workers are the primary direct employment, but the indirect employment has a much broader implication. In other words, we all throughout this, the economy depend on these Hispanic frontline workers in the green sectors, and we'll probably do so much more into the future. So what we've done is a mapping strategy for looking at how this is currently defined as an equity dynamic, as well as going forward, what might it look like? And I'll show you how we use that to describe this challenge at the local levels going forward. So DWP, specifically, we've done then this analysis of its employment footprint and what type of race, ethnic, gender dynamics, and could we also see now and anticipate in the future with new investments, and specifically looking at this disadvantaged communities and non-disadvantaged communities, both currently and going forward. So the biggest takeaways from the LADWP report is that, again, Hispanics do make up the largest share of employees in the power sector of DWP, and then follow in certain sectors, construction and production. Most DWP workers are well paid and don't live in the disadvantaged communities. However, Hispanics do make up the largest share, interestingly enough, of the DWP workers who are living in the disadvantaged communities. And Blacks and Hispanic workers earn the lowest wages. But again, that does not mean that they are underpaid in terms of their occupations. It's the question is, how do we both expand the employment base and make sure that the structure of employment and its improvements are distributed more equitably throughout the city. So what we see again is, in particular sectors, the production sector of energy is anticipated to go through important changes, especially as we're looking to retire in-basin carbon generation. That will be a major challenge in terms of employment shifting, and particularly in places like Wilmington and the disadvantaged communities where a lot of this is focused on. So again, we can look, our tool will allow us to look at these specific employment dynamics, both direct, indirect, and induced within the disadvantaged communities as well as the non-disadvantaged communities. And now what we see is that when we project going into the future, what's going to happen, we will start from these baseline inequality gaps and estimate the employment impacts of new DWP investments, and compare those to the demographic changes, so that we're basically looking at the future in terms of creating a workforce of the future and making sure that we're creating the necessary workforce development investments that will take us there. So this is just a quick review of the methodology for estimating this DWP employment and investment strategies from the policy objectives, which are, for example, to retire this in-basin carbon. What impacts on investments will that imply? And what type of employment costs, and then the direct, indirect, and induced employment effects of those investments? What type of job equity training would be necessary given the future racial demographics in order to then generate this analysis and have equity impacts? Finally, as I said, we're looking at a community case studies to really sort of ground this analysis in actual detailed zip code and census tract work that will complement with my colleagues, and which be more than happy to talk more about in the discussion. But just one interesting thing we are doing is engaging the community with this type of data, not only to be made available online to everybody, but specifically then work with community members to analyze this data and think about what it means for their communities into the future that they would like to see. And we're engaged, as I said, now in this ongoing process of community dialogue with evidence-based analysis, and then beginning to, on that basis, construct a strategy for workforce development. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your work and your presentation. I'll kick things off. I see we have some questions in the chat already, but wanted to ask you, what sort of strategies might be employed to ensure a just workforce transition as LA moves towards carbon-free energy generation.
Correct. And again, there will be issues specifically to the carbon and energy sector. So DWP, it's extremely interesting, and we thank DWP, frankly, and it's great that I just got back from the COP conference in Egypt, where I was able to see that not everybody has a utility that is responsive this way, which we've structured in Los Angeles. We're very lucky, and this case study, is really, important. So it is focused on DWP, as I was saying, but there are other providers in the LA County area and in California, which this study also contemplates being able to do the analysis of. In the LA area, obviously, this issue of what is the changing mix of employment during the transition to new infrastructure that will move away from just frankly a coal-based system, which is has been agreed has to be eliminated, which is a problem, by the way, of utilities across the world, and how do we envision various types of technologies and the training that would be necessary, which are not there yet. So it's important that we look at the types of technology and the training that may be coming down the pike, and already prepare pipelines and communities to understand the nature of the transitions. And in general, this notion of green jobs, a lot of employment throughout the city and other sectors, as my colleagues have discussed, are going to also undergo changes. And we need to think about more broadly training for the next green economy, and make it sure that I mean, the irony is that our first types, we haven't published this yet, but work is if we have this growth and dependence on low-wage Hispanic workers in many of these transition activities, this could have an impact on equity in the short run. How do we make sure that the green workforce of the future does provide more living wage and greater social equity? And it will be a major challenge that at least we're beginning to identify, I think, the scope of that.
Thank you. You just mentioned pipeline, and it reminded me of sort of pipeline of funding that's coming from the state for economic recovery. I'm thinking specifically about the Community Economic Resilience Fund. It's the $600 million state fund. It's already allocated $5 million in a planning grant to the LA Collaborative that's being managed by LAEDC. And I'm wondering how your research findings can help inform the work of the SURF Collaborative.
Right, and in fact, what we are doing once we have a scope of what type of employment needs we need to train for, what type of funding is there available for that, and what type of institutional responses need to be mobilized. And again, with a real focus on the disadvantaged communities, right? I mean, there are a number of funds that are coming in, and they could have macro effects. But what our goal is to make sure that the frontline communities, the ones affecting, with our other colleagues, both the direct pollution effect as well as maybe the potential economic burden of these transitions, are taken into account at the same time that we're looking at preparing the workforce, starting from K through 12, actually over a 10-15 year period of time, to make sure that they have the skills to have a more a productive set of employment potentials going forward. So yeah, I think one of the reasons we are looking at the very local level is a lot of this funding has yet to be determined how it's going to be reaching the local levels. And frankly, the better communities are informed and organized and working, creating organizations themselves and partnering with the right types of entities that are focused on solving local issues. I think that that's both what Washington has, this great, and Sacramento is great opportunities that we have, especially the focus on disadvantaged communities. But what we're finding so far anyway, is that a lot of the disadvantaged communities, the capacity is not there yet to take advantage of this. And I think that this is where the governance issue, both of DWP, the city, and other actors, to make sure that we do empower those a strategy that is rooted and has not only a community engagement, but community impact in the evaluation of what we're doing.
Thank you. Can we dig into a little bit of the findings and a couple of the takeaways? You had said that the LAWP employee data, that there's a large wage gap with Hispanics and Blacks earning the lowest wages of DWP workers living in DACs and in non-DACs. Have you had conversations with the department about strategies to close those gaps?
Well, sure. And again, I want to be very clear. What this is a reflection of is the occupational difference, the mix. Most workers in the maintenance sector, in the construction sector, are the relatively low-paid sectors. And within those sectors, there is no racial discrimination, let us say, between groups. In fact, it could be quite the opposite, that Hispanic workers with seniority are doing quite well. But obviously, there's a difference between wage levels at those types of occupations and a lot of what is in DWP, which is the engineering staff and the management staff. So I think that I'm very frankly impressed that now a lot of this research is becoming very relevant to DWP. They are engaged in a workforce development and a human resource development planning that is now taking into account these types of questions. And again, I think is commitment from the interviews that I've seen in this that we've had with both DWP staff and what the community would like to see, some interesting alignments. And again, this would be a great opportunity, example, frankly, of how local utilities can work with the community and think about the transition going forward, and see these key stakeholders, which I think have a great deal to contribute, not only in terms of the vision and the planning, but into the future workforce, of which the interest among young people is fascinating. I think young people are getting it. This is their future. This is their future world, and this is their future jobs that people want to start thinking about.
Oh, absolutely. I have a 5-year-old who is absolutely a future engineer. He gets it. One last question for you. Could you, when you were looking at wages, could you determine if the DWP job made it possible for folks to move out of the DAC area?
I'm sorry, once again?
Could you determine if the DWP job made it possible for folks to move out of the DAC area?
Well, what you mean, will there be job loss in the DAC areas?
I think the question from the chat, and Keisha, I'll let you jump in if you'd like to unmute and clarify.
Yes, so actually, thank you, hold on. My question was really whether or not the position at DWP afforded them the opportunity to move out of the area. So I know one of the challenges, for example, that Edison had with the jobs in Compton, they couldn't hold anyone there. They'd get a job, I'm sorry, not with Edison, with the gas company. They get a job with the gas company there, and then they'd move out.
That's absolutely the case, by the way. And we see that at our local level. I mean, in many ways, people would love to get jobs in Wilmington in DWP so they can move to another neighborhood, right, where there isn't that much direct pollution and crime. But I think part of the issue is, are we at least drawing from these disadvantaged areas the workers of the future? I think that's the important part about it. And frankly, I mean, Wilmington is interesting because it sits in the middle of 5 of the major refineries in California and the United States, of which the transition probably is going to mean that they're having to move out of oil extraction and refining, maybe into other forms of maybe green hydrogen was mentioned. These types of facilities could play an important role there. So I think the issue is that we do need to understand that the energy conversion is going to fundamentally redesign the employment trajectories and the economic futures of these disadvantaged communities, and that now those who have suffered the most already are not left behind, but actually do participate and are active beneficiaries of the investments that will be a part of this new transition.
That is great, Raúl. And I failed you. I should have introduced myself. I am an ally. My name is Keisha Washington. I'm the Director of Innovation and Strategic Partnerships at LADWP. And this has kind of been my mission work since working with Antonio Hinojosa in his office, as we kind of looked at where are we drawing from and how do we make sure the frustration that I've had where we've got programs that we bring in folks from outside of the area to provide services to our customers in the area instead of looking there.
Great. Look forward to talking with you soon.
Yes.
All right.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hinojosa. Go ahead, Cassie.
Thank you, Raúl. Thank you, Keisha. We're going to move on to the next presentation today. This is a really interesting project. I'm excited for you to hear about it. First, we have Dr. Crist Khachikian. He is a professor in civil engineering at the California State University, Northridge. He served as CSUN's Associate Vice President for Research and the Graduate Dean. He was the director of a multidisciplinary Center for Energy and Sustainability, and he currently co-directs two programs, one focused on diversifying the biomedical workforce and the other to promote entrepreneurship and innovation across campus. The other speaker today is Dr. Natale Zappia. He's an associate professor of history and the director of the Institute for Sustainability at Cal State Northridge. His work explores the intersection of food systems, indigenous political economies, and ecological transformations across early North America. His recent book, Traders and Raiders, The Indigenous World of the Colorado Basin, tells the early history of the lower Colorado River, a watershed that looms large over the modern urban landscapes of Los Angeles, and a book I look forward to reading. Today we'll hear about an assistance and training program for the Community Emission Reduction Grant. The LADWP project manager for this work is Keisha Washington, who we just heard from. She is the Director of Innovation, External and Regulatory Affairs, and she is actually going to do a brief introduction before we pass over the presentation to Crist and to Natale. So I'm going to pass it on to Keisha.
Good morning, all. It is still good morning, and thank you very much for the opportunity to address you. This was the result of, we had did an earlier grant program at DWP for emission reductions. And one of the challenges we had is sometimes you see the same folks applying because they know what they're doing and they're good at it. But if we were truly looking to source solutions from the community, we had to go to the community and meet them where they were. And sometimes that meant that sometimes the community didn't understand DWP or DWP engineer speak. So for example, in filling out a grant application, and then we tasked them with figuring out how do you calculate the emission reductions, that became almost a barrier to entry. So in working with Crist and with Natale, as well as the Center for Nonprofit Management, we tasked them with coming up with a boot camp that not only assisted them in understanding the grant application process, responding to it, but also addressing the technical issues. And my dream world is we're arming them to do more of this work in the future, because we really do want to source the ideas from the folks who are most impacted by the emissions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Crist and Natale.
Thank you, Keisha. That was a wonderful intro. Good morning, everyone. My name is Crist Khachikian, and I'll start off this conversation, and Nat will jump in as he sees fit. So yes, this is the Community Emission Reduction Grants Program. This was run in one cycle of it. It was run a few years back, and awardees were made, and the projects were started. And when Keisha and the team received some feedback about maybe diversifying the groups that are engaging, we got involved in the second phase of this. And it was a while, Keisha. I think it took us a good 9 months to figure out exactly how we're going to approach this, how are we going to get as much representation as we can in the council districts that you were interested in. So this was a wonderful learning experience for us as well. What happens when you have all these policy ideals and all these programs that you're trying to implement at the community level? How does it actually play out? How do people react to it, and how do they make their dreams a reality? So as Keisha mentioned, there were 2 groups that were involved. There was CSUN team as Nat and myself. There was the Center for Nonprofit Management. They were, right next to us doing everything that we were doing and working with the team. So we really appreciate the collaboration with CNM as well. Excuse me. Keisha, we worked with you a lot. We also worked with Tasia, an environmental engineer, who helped us walk us through the calculations and the technical pieces first, so that we can turn around and help the community. And Andrea and Catherine were also part of the team.
And thanks, Steve.
Yes, Steve as well. Sorry, Steve. You're not on my screen right now. Yes, thank you, Steve. So this has been a 5 or 6 year ongoing project. It's $20 million total that was going to be given out for emission reduction programs in the Harbor and Valley communities. I'll talk about the council districts. And it was mainly for nonprofits who have some kind of a community engagement, community outreach component to it. So they would either have to do a community needs assessment, or I would have done that previously to know what the needs are, to implement basically an electrification program to help their nonprofit as well as the community. The districts we're working in are 2, 6, and 7, which are this, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but in this top north area where there's a little bit of a red zone, and then District 15, which is down at the south area. These are where the LADWP power plants are located. Their emissions are relatively low, but there's a commitment from LADWP again to implement projects at the community level to help reduce the emissions as much as possible. So this ties in very well with some of the things we've been talking about. The outline of the project, again, it's those 4 council districts, maximum of 3 years to implement the entire project. And the projects have to enable or have to have some energy-related environmental benefits. There's also a workforce development aspect to this as well. The more they can engage community members in the project, the better. The potential applicants were nonprofits, and public agencies, including regulatory agencies, were allowed to. I don't think the final announcements have been made. The people we reached out to and the people we worked with were mostly in the nonprofit sector. I'm sure there are many people who knew how to do this. As Keisha said, they have turnkey solutions on how to apply to these kinds of grants. They didn't really necessarily reach out to us, but we did reach out to a number of nonprofits, especially some of the smaller ones who've never gotten funding from LADWP, with a host of questions, and I'll try to capture what those conversations were like. This is last set of grantees, and we thought we would share this with you so you get a sense of the types of projects that were happening. So some of these names are very familiar. Climate Resolve, for example, they installed cool roofs with photovoltaics. Excuse me. As you can see, there's a number of there's a e-bikes program, lots of solar panels. There's a lot of community outreach work, EV chargers. The Pacoima Beautiful, the bottom of the list, for example, they had a bunch of e-bikes that were donated for them, but they didn't have the mechanisms to actually to work with sorry, I just got a chat, to deploy that program. So here's, again, Climate Resolve has the cool roofs, Pacoima Beautiful did the electrical bike program, and then there was the Green Affordable Housing with the U.S. Green Buildings Coalition. So, oops, sorry. Oops, I'm going the wrong way. Here we go. So the new partnership, as Keisha mentioned, was we needed to attract more and more diverse nonprofit organizations to this granting program. There was a need to diversify the solutions as well, look at different ways to electrify. And then the big part of our work was to provide technical assistance to smaller nonprofits who, again, either don't have the bandwidth, the personnel, or the experience to do this properly. So what we did was, obviously, both Center for Nonprofit Management and CSUN have a pretty vast Rolodex of nonprofit organizations. So there was numerous email blasts that went out on a weekly basis to over 11,000 nonprofits, trying to get them excited about this. The Center for Nonprofit Management did a personal calls. 500 organizations were reached out to directly, and of those, 145 registered to our informational sessions. We reached out to council district offices, and we also reached out to our higher ed partners. There were 40 or so, including UCLA, actually. That's where I met Aaron. There were 40 or so universities and community colleges that have a footprint in the sustainability world that we reached out to and said, do any of your partners qualify for, or are they interested in this project? And what we called the whole program was an activation academy. There were a sort of sequence of timed workshops and events. So we obviously were workshops around the math and science. This is where CSUN did most of their work. We walked people through how to do the calculations and so forth. CNM took on the workshop on program planning and helped with grant writers. How do you actually plan a project like this over a 2-year period? How do you implement it? And then supplied grant writers to help people actually put the grant together. And then there were individual meetings with these grant writers. We helped people create a work plan. And then at the end, we also talked about program evaluation. How do you actually assess and evaluate what you did was actually working? And then the applications were due July 15th. I think the selections were made, but this information is not yet public, so we can't share. We don't know it, so I can't share it anyway. And so between the last month, where most of the activity was happening, I just did a rough count to figure out what the activity was like and what people were doing. There were over 120 technical email exchanges, and these are separate threads back and forth about particular aspects of the program. Lots of questions about what does the LADWP actually want, and how much greenhouse gas offsets do they want? So very specific questions about the program. There were 10 online working sessions with 6 specific nonprofit organizations who are very new to this. And we believe 4 of them are going to be receiving funding, but we don't know. So I won't disclose anything else. They reached out to us and said, thank you so much for your help. We got funded. And most of the questions we fielded actually centered on these emissions calculations. How do we quantify this properly? How do we show that we're having an impact in the community? And then, so the lessons we learned, which we passed on to the LADWP, is it's hard to work with nonprofits who don't have a lot of experience. And so some of them needed a lot of time. So timeline was key, giving them adequate time to plan, think about, conceptualize, work with technical partners to implement the program was very important. We thought a peer marketing / outreach component would be really nice. So if they hear from other nonprofits, even nonprofits that are neighbors of theirs who have done this successfully, we think that'll encourage more people to apply, because there is a barrier to entry. It is the LADWP, which is this big institution. The technical pieces are challenging. I mean, I went back and forth with Tasia, and I come from this world, but I still had to go back and forth and figure out what exactly is meant by some of the program features. And with that comes, maybe we can provide some more focused resources that help people navigate the RFP, but also their project properly. And I just want to share 2 specific things that we came up against, which was really interesting, that I don't think about because we're not boots on the ground deploying these things. We had questions about, what if the building is leased and we don't own the building? Can we put solar panels up? How does that work out? Who owns them? And so there were technical questions around that. And then we did earlier, I think Stephanie mentioned about electrifying stoves in restaurants. We did have a group that was very interested in doing that, but immediately we got into the space of, we have to train all these employees to use electric stoves, and that kind of changes the workflow. It disrupts the workflow a little bit. The heating and the cooling of those stoves are very different than a gas stove. So there are practical barriers to some of these projects. So with that, maybe I'm going to ask Nat to join me for a minute. I don't know, Nat, if I left off anything that you want to add.
Well, just, I mean, you covered everything, I think. In terms of takeaways too, I think, and, Keisha mentioned this, and this is a theme that's come up a few times today, is, we're talking about infrastructure, and I like how Raúl was framing the, equity infrastructure or the equity gaps. And so I think a lot of what we did as well, and I think a lot of nonprofits is relationship building and thinking about energy and, energy reduction, of course, it's a physical thing, but also that intersection with building community and relationships. And that allowed, I think, Chris just mentioned that one nonprofit who was thinking about the electrification of the stoves. And, the idea was that they work with a lot of different local restaurants, mom and pop restaurants that of course lease these spaces, and that didn't work out. But the conversations, many conversations we had with organizations like that, and it built this relationship between CSUN and CNM and LADWP and these community members who have, who if they didn't apply for the grant, it's now on their radar, and now it's the word of mouth, which is what part of the goals of this grant is for for the next one, and to kind of think about these relationships. So I think that was really effective and something that I know all the applicants really appreciated.
Yeah, and one thing we heard, which was kind of funny, and I passed this on to Keisha and Steve, was if the LADWP has to hire people to help with technical assistance, this must be a really difficult program. So it kind of backfired in some ways, where we had to tell people, no, that's not the case. It's not that it's very difficult, but we're here just to help you as part of your team. So that was an interesting outcome that we heard from some of our partners. So with that, I'll stop there. And I know I was a little over time. I apologize. And we're happy to take any questions.
We do just have a couple minutes left, so I want to encourage folks to ask questions in the chat. I'll kick things off with one. Continuing that comment about building relationships, how did you conduct your outreach campaign to encourage nonprofits to submit proposals? And then if you have a number, I'm curious of how many additional applications did LADWP receive?
I can maybe take that first part, and then Keisha, that's you have the information on that second part. So basically, it was a lot of email, phone conversations that look at us as your partner. We're here to help you. So whatever you're lacking in your team that you think you may need, then we're part of your team. So it was a lot of, as Nat mentioned, relationship building, a lot of conversations about, don't worry about the technical pieces. Just tell me what you want to do. Let's talk through this, because talking to Keisha and the team, we were kind of informed. Well, we were informed of what the LADWP wants as part of their goal. So it was easy for us to say, well, maybe that project doesn't quite work. What if you did this? And so we spent a lot of time trying to understand what the overall goals of the nonprofits are. And we were very clear, if this is not part of your plan and it sounds like a big reach, be careful, because it can be too much for you to handle. You may not have the capacity. So I think it was a lot of honest conversations and good feedback with the nonprofits. And over time, we kind of built that relationship with them, so that when they got to the technical pieces, they were very comfortable texting us and saying, I have no clue how to do this. Can you help? And it was easy to have that conversation at that point.
And let me just chime in on a couple of things. One of the reasons that we went with CSUN and the center is this is resources that in an ideal world, DWP probably could have provided. The challenge is we are also evaluating the application. So we wanted to make sure that we were separating ourselves from it. And then the other thing is, along with that is, again, making sure that these folks are empowered. So you may have learned with DWP, but if there are other grants out there, having conversations with some of my industry peers at Edison and AQMD, they all like the concept of this. And we've discussed in the future, looking at something a little bit broader for all of these public agencies that offer these grants and say we want to be community focused, to be able to provide the community with access to do that. Now, in terms of the numbers, you caught me off guard. I don't have it off the top of my head, but I can tell you there are at least 10 new applications. So of course, we got folks who always replied. Like I said, they've got a machine, they know how to do it, and they do it well. But again, part of our focus was, again, I want to get as close to the community as possible and to be able to reach those hidden jewels that we don't know who exist. So I think we were successful in that, but not only that, I think that along with CNM and CSUN, we built a reputation of saying, when we have this next round out, and we will take their guidance, having a longer lead time, but we'll be able to go a little bit deeper and a little bit broader. And it's not just the diversity of the nonprofits, but it's the diversity of the solutions. And
Mhm.
that's kind of a dead horse that I beat when I talk about supplier diversity. It's not that I just want to do business with a minority or women. No, I want to see what their solutions are. How do they attack the problem from their perspective? So I think with that, we've done well. I'm really happy to have worked with this team. I can only foresee greater things. And I think going forward, to the extent that we can even make this almost an industry standard for folks giving out grants. If we say we want to be part of the community, then let's do that.
Oh, thank you so much for that. We are at time, so Cassie, I'll hand it back to you to close out. Thank you so much to you all for joining us today. I really, really appreciate it.
Get my light on. All right. Thank you so much, Erin. And thank you, Crist and Natale and Kessia for that presentation and thoughtful programming that you've developed for that. Thanks so much to everyone for attending the research symposium today. I do want to thank LARC and the LADWP for partnering on this event, and DWP for partnering with the UCLA Sustainable LA Grand Challenge on these and other co-developed research projects aimed at making LA the world's most sustainable megacity. The success of our Grand Challenge program at UCLA really does depend on partnerships with folks like you, so please don't hesitate to reach out with questions or partnership ideas at sustainablela@ucla.edu. Before you go, we do ask that you please complete the Zoom survey that will pop up in your browser as you leave the Zoom meeting today. I encourage you to share your feedback to help us identify future research priorities. Again, thank you and have a great day.